Imagine this is your leg. The pain is unbearable, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is the gangrene that will kill you in 3 days. There is no hospital, no surgeon. There is only a ship's carpenter with a saw, a crew to hold you down, and a bottle of rum. This isn't a choice between pain and health. It's a choice between torture and death. And now, we will show you the protocol that made survival possible in this hell. Your leg wasn't shattered by a cannonball, but by grape shot, a small bag filled with metal balls. Its purpose wasn't to sink the ship, but to maim the crew. In the hot, humid climate of the Caribbean, gangrene developed not in days, but in hours. A wound became a ticking time bomb. On a ship filled with gold, there was no professional doctor. The reason wasn't a lack of money. It was the very status of pirates as outlaws. Any qualified doctor on board would automatically become an accomplice, a pirate. It was a one-way ticket. The surgeon, Alexander Esquemelin, author of The Buccaneers of America, was forced to become one of them. Captured by Henry Morgan, he faced an absolute dilemma: save criminals or die. But how could a man not only agree to an amputation but also assist in the process, holding his own leg? This inhuman will was not born from medicine. It was born from the pirate code, a brutal but fair social contract. This code turned torture into an investment. The Articles of Bartholomew Roberts were more reliable than any state pension for sailors in the Royal Navy. The operation became not an act of desperation, but a calculated business transaction with one's own body. The role of the surgeon was taken by the ship's carpenter. His hands were accustomed to the resistance of materials. His tools were the sharpest on board, and his mind was free from the Hippocratic oath. He approached a man like he would a broken mast. He didn't think about nerves or muscles. He thought about the structure that needed to be saved. His saw wasn't a surgical instrument but a carpenter's backsaw, designed for rough cuts in wood. His job was to separate the rot as quickly and cleanly as possible, whether from a plank or a bone. The first tool in this protocol was rum. A lot of rum. Navy-strength rum at about 57% alcohol. It was given to the man until he lost consciousness or the will to resist. This was not anesthesia. It was the suppression of instinct. But this method had a fatal side effect. Alcohol caused vasodilation, a sharp expansion of the blood vessels. It thinned the blood. It was like trying to extinguish a fire with kerosene. You douse the flames of consciousness to dull the pain, but simultaneously fuel the fire of bleeding that will kill you faster than the saw. Then came the instrument itself. Not a delicate surgical saw, but a coarse carpenter's tool. Its large teeth were designed to rip through wood fibers, not to neatly sever bone. Every pull of the saw tore rather than cut. Every push sent vibrations through the entire body, turning an attempt at salvation into an act of pure destruction. At that moment, your body is a corporation on the verge of bankruptcy. One of its subsidiaries, your limb, is infected with a toxic acid, gangrene, and it threatens to bring down the entire system. You have a choice: immediately liquidate this branch, incurring terrible but finite losses, or wait until the toxicity spreads and leads to total collapse. This is not a medical decision. It is the decision of a crisis manager. Once the limb was severed, a race against time began to stop the bleeding. The arteries were cauterized with a knife or even an axe blade heated in the fire. The sizzle of burning meat and the smell of charred flesh were the signals that the most dangerous stage was over. This wasn't pirate savagery, but standard military practice, which progressive surgeons like Ambrose Paré had abandoned back in the 16th century. It was a crude form of welding. The red-hot metal literally melted and sealed the edges of the blood vessels, creating an ugly but effective seam of burnt flesh. But even this was not enough. Blood continued to seep. The wound needed a sealant, something that could seal it permanently from salt water and dirt. And they had such a material. It was always on hand, in a barrel on deck. And its application was perhaps more terrifying than the amputation itself. The pirates were about to patch up a man just as they would patch a leak in the ship's hull. The same material, The same logic. The man was not a patient, but a part of the ship that needed to be made waterproof urgently. That very same ship's tar, boiling Stockholm tar. First, immobilization. 4 or 5 of the strongest sailors would grab your arms, legs, and head. They weren't there to comfort you, they were there to restrain you. A lead bullet or a thick piece of leather was placed in your mouth. This is the literal origin of the phrase, to bite the bullet. Lead was soft enough not to break tooth enamel, but hard enough to withstand the pressure of a jaw clenched in a scream-induced spasm. The men inflicting this pain on you were your best friends. In that moment, they became your executioners in order to save your life. It was an act of ultimate trust, expressed through ultimate brutality. Then, the carpenter would make one quick, circular cut with a knife, through the skin and muscle, down to the bone. And he would take the saw. The hardest part was starting. The first few movements were short and scratching, creating a guide groove. And then, fast, powerful strokes. The grating sound of the saw against bone could be heard throughout the ship. It took 3 to 5 minutes, 3 minutes of pure, concentrated hell. For comparison, Napoleon's top surgeon, Dominique Jean Leray, could perform a battlefield amputation in under a minute. The carpenter, however, performed a simple guillotine amputation, a straight cut that was nearly impossible to close neatly. Now, see this through the eyes of the crew. You hear your comrade's screams. You feel his body thrashing in agony under your hands, but you cannot loosen your grip. If you falter, the carpenter might miss, damage the artery further, and it would all be over. Your crew was a bomb disposal squad defusing a device inside a living person. Any sympathy at that moment would have been a fatal mistake. Your cruelty was a form of supreme concentration. Once the limb was severed, it was thrown overboard without a word. Silence would fall. The carpenter would take a red-hot knife and press it against the bleeding stump. At this moment, the pain reached its absolute peak, a flash of white light in the consciousness, and often, darkness. This process is called thermal necrosis. The nerve endings were simply burned away. For the crew, the hissing sound and the smell of burnt flesh were not sounds of horror. They were the sounds of success, a signal that their comrade might live. The final act. An assistant would bring a bucket of boiling ship's tar. The carpenter would take the stump and, without hesitation, plunge it directly into the bubbling black mass. The scream, if the man was still conscious, was no longer human. The tar instantly created a hard, waterproof crust. It was shock sterilization and a hermetic dressing in one. Stockholm tar, derived from pine, had natural antiseptic properties. This black armor was a primitive but brilliant bandage. If the patient survived, the body would eventually reject it as new tissue grew underneath. It was a self-removing scab forged in hell. But amputation was a last resort. Something less fatal, like a bullet in the shoulder, required a different protocol. Without an X-ray, the surgeon, or rather the butcher, worked blind. He would insert a finger or a metal probe into the wound, trying to feel for the lead. Then he would widen the incision with a knife and attempt to extract the fragment with forceps. It was a game of operation where instead of a buzzer, a mistake was announced by a fountain of arterial blood from the wound. But the main killer wasn't the probe, it was the dirt on it. This dirt introduced tetanus into the bloodstream, the disease of lockjaw, which killed slowly through monstrous muscle spasms that would arch the body backward. However, a pirate's most terrifying enemy was not the Spanish or infection. It was scurvy. A deficiency of vitamin C turned the body into a ruin. Gums rotted and bled. Teeth fell out. Old, long-healed scars suddenly reopened. A man would literally decompose while still alive and fully conscious. During Commodore George Anson's circumnavigation of the globe, nearly 1,400 of his 1,854 sailors died, mostly from scurvy. Scurvy is when the body forgets how to repair itself. Collagen, the molecular glue that holds your tissues together, ceases to be produced. The very structure of your body begins to crumble. Let's introduce a survival scale. The chance of surviving an amputation under those conditions was about 30%. After a gunshot wound to the torso, less than 10%, and the chance of avoiding scurvy on a long voyage was practically zero. The most likely death for a pirate was not in battle. It was slow and humiliating. Even a successful amputation was often just a stay of execution, as sepsis would set in days later. A pirate was constantly playing Russian roulette. A bullet in battle was 1 round in the chamber. An amputation was 4 rounds. With scurvy, the cylinder was fully loaded. But sometimes, nature itself offered a clue, the most disgusting clue. Pirates noticed a paradox. Wounds that became infested with maggots healed faster and cleaner. Intuitively, they understood what science would later prove. Maggots consume only dead necrotic tissue, but they didn't just clean the wound. Their secretions are a powerful antibacterial cocktail. They were microscopic surgeons, working with a precision unattainable by humans, while simultaneously administering an antibiotic into the wound. Nature provided the perfect medicine, wrapped in the most repulsive packaging. This willpower was not born from courage. It was born from a complete lack of choice. On land, a person with such an injury could hope for a miracle, wait for help. In the ocean, the choice was binary, either a few minutes of unbearable pain right now, or a 100% certain agonizing death from gangrene in a few days. This absolute clarity cut through all doubt, leaving only cold determination. Psychology calls this freedom from the paralysis of choice. When the only options are horrific and fatal, the brain stops wasting energy on indecision. Imagine you are on the roof of a burning skyscraper. You don't contemplate the design of the fire escape, you just climb down it. The amputation was that fire escape from hell. But there was also a primary motivator. The pirate code clearly stipulated compensation for injuries. Lose a right arm, get 600 pieces of 8, lose a leg, 500, an eye, 100. It was the most reliable insurance policy in the world. A pirate undergoing amputation knew that if he survived, he would receive a share that would provide for him ashore. Pain was monetized. Torture became a transaction. According to Bartholomew Roberts's code, 600 silver pieces of 8 for a right arm was equivalent to a Royal Navy sailor's salary for 3 or even 4 years. This turned his body into capital and his injury into a risky but highly profitable investment. The one-legged pirate with a hook for a hand is not a cliché. He is a symbol of a survivor. He proved his worth by going through hell, and he was still useful. He could reload a cannon, stand at the helm, and perform dozens of other tasks. The crew was invested in saving him because every man counted. The operation was not an act of mercy, but a collective decision to preserve a fighting unit. Your scars were your resume. The French captain François Leclerc, nicknamed Pegleg, successfully commanded a flotilla after losing his limb. It was proof that amputation was not the end of a career, but its brutal confirmation. This system worked, brutal surgery supported by an iron code, but it didn't just create survivors, it created something else. Constant exposure to such trauma inevitably led to severe post-traumatic stress disorder and a complete desensitization to the pain of others. The process was like tempering steel. The metal becomes stronger but loses its flexibility. They became inhumanly resilient, but perhaps they also lost a part of their humanity. It turned them into steel, or simply slag. This entire hell boils down to a simple survival protocol. First, accept the inevitable. The faster you accept the worst-case scenario, the more resources you have to fight. Hesitation is a luxury the ocean does not forgive. Second, trust the algorithm, not a miracle. They had a barbaric but clear process: rum, saw, fire, tar. Third, find your compensation. For them, it was money. For you, it might be family, a purpose, or revenge, a reason that outweighs any pain. This 3-step protocol is remarkably similar to the psychological training of Special Forces operators. Assess and accept the situation, follow the protocol, and focus on the objective. A pirate ship was an extreme school of survival whose lessons are still relevant today. And here lies the central paradox of this system. It was simultaneously the ultimate social contract, where a group went to extreme lengths to save an individual, and the complete commodification of the body, where a price tag was placed on every limb and a person became a resource to be repaired or written off. Perhaps one was impossible without the other. Write just one word in the comments, strength or cruelty. Let's see which one prevails.